The lightning split the Montana sky in half just as Eleanor Sutton felt the wagon lurch sideways, and she knew with terrible certainty that she was about to die. The storm had come out of nowhere on that August evening in 1883, transforming the rolling prairie outside Helena into a nightmare of wind and rain that sent her two horses screaming in panic. And now the wagon was tipping, the world spinning as wood cracked and split around her. She felt the crushing weight settle across her legs and lower back, pinning her to the mud as the rain hammered down like bullets. And through the pain and terror, she could only think of how her father would find her body come morning, broken and cold in the grass. The pain was extraordinary, sharp and hot where the wagon's frame pressed against her spine, and she tried to scream, but the wind tore the sound from her throat. Water streamed into her eyes as she clawed at the mud, trying desperately to pull herself free, but the weight was impossible. Hundreds of pounds of oak and iron holding her fast to the earth. Her horses had torn free from their traces and vanished into the storm, leaving her utterly alone beneath the black sky. Thunder rolled across the prairie like cannon fire, and Eleanor pressed her face into the wet grass and sobbed, feeling her strength draining away with each labored breath. She did not know how long she lay there before she heard the hoofbeats. At first, she thought it was thunder, another roll of sound across the plains, but then she realized it was getting closer, steady and rhythmic, even through the chaos of the storm. Eleanor lifted her head as much as she could, rain streaming down her face, and saw a dark shape moving through the curtain of water. A horse, massive and black, and atop it a man in a wide-brimmed hat that channeled rain off its edges like a waterfall. "Help!" she tried to cry out, but her voice was barely a whisper, lost in the wind. "Please help me." The rider pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away and swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion. He was tall. She could see that even through the rain, broad-shouldered beneath a soaked duster coat that clung to his frame. He ran toward her, his boots splashing through the mud, and dropped to his knees beside the overturned wagon. "Are you hurt?" His voice was deep, rough with urgency, and he put his hand on her shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Can you feel your legs?" "I can feel them," Eleanor gasped, and the pain lancing up her spine confirmed it. "I cannot move them. The weight, it is too much." The man moved around her, assessing the situation with quick, efficient movements. She could see his face now when the lightning flashed, strong-jawed, maybe 30 years old, with dark stubble and eyes that were focused and calm despite the chaos around them. He wore the rough clothing of a working cowboy, denim and leather and cotton all soaked through, and she could see the muscles in his arms flexing as he gripped the wagon's side. "I am going to lift this off you," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "When I do, you need to pull yourself clear. Can you do that?" Eleanor stared at him through the rain. The wagon had to weigh at least 500 pounds, probably more with all her supplies still loaded in the bed. "You cannot lift that alone," she said. "It is impossible. Watch me." He moved to where the wagon lay heaviest across her body and set his feet wide in the mud. His hands found purchase on the wagon's edge, and Eleanor saw him take a deep breath, his whole body tensing. "When I say now, you pull. Understand?" She nodded, not believing it could work, but having no other choice. The pain was getting worse, a grinding agony that made her vision blur at the edges, and she knew she did not have much time before something important gave way inside her body. The cowboy bent his knees, and Eleanor heard him growl low in his throat as he began to lift. His back straightened, every muscle straining, and impossibly, incredibly, the wagon began to rise. The pressure on her legs eased slightly, then more, and Eleanor saw the gap widening between the wagon's frame and the earth. "Now," the man gritted out, his face contorted with effort, veins standing out on his neck. "Move now." Eleanor dug her fingers into the mud and pulled with everything she had left. Pain exploded through her body as her legs came free, but she ignored it, dragging herself forward, inch by agonizing inch until she was clear. The moment she was out, the cowboy let the wagon drop with a tremendous crash that sent mud flying in all directions. He staggered back, breathing hard, and then dropped to his knees beside her. "Let me see," he said, his hands already moving to check her legs through the sodden fabric of her dress. His touch was careful, professional, the touch of someone who had tended to injuries before. Eleanor hissed in pain as his fingers found a particularly tender spot on her left shin, but nothing seemed to be broken. The wagon had caught her at an angle, she realized, distributing the weight just enough to keep her bones intact even if the pain was tremendous. "I think you will be all right," the cowboy said, and there was relief in his voice. "Bruised badly, but nothing broken that I can feel. Can you stand?" "I do not know," Eleanor admitted. The rain was still pouring down, plastering her dark hair to her skull, and she was shaking from cold and shock. "I do not think so." The man did not hesitate. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back and lifted her as easily as he had lifted the wagon, cradling her against his chest as he stood. Eleanor gasped and wrapped her arms around his neck, suddenly aware of how close they were, close enough that she could smell leather and horse and rain-soaked cotton, close enough to see the concern in his eyes. "My horse can carry us both," he said, already moving toward the massive black gelding that stood waiting patiently in the storm. "Helena is only 3 miles east. I will take you to the doctor." "My wagon," Eleanor protested weakly. "My supplies, my horses, they ran off and I need to find them." "Your life is worth more than a wagon," the cowboy said flatly. "We will come back for it tomorrow when the storm has passed." He reached his horse and somehow managed to lift her into the saddle despite the rain and the mud and her dead weight in his arms. Then he swung up behind her, one arm coming around her waist to hold her steady against his chest, and took up the reins with his free hand. "Hold on," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear, and Eleanor let herself lean back against him as he urged the horse into a canter. The ride to Helena passed in a blur of pain and rain and the steady, solid presence of the man behind her. Eleanor drifted in and out of awareness, her body finally succumbing to the shock of what had happened, and each time she surfaced, she found herself held secure in the cowboy's arm, his voice murmuring reassurances that she could barely hear over the storm. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and gas lights were beginning to flicker on in windows along the main street. The cowboy guided his horse directly to a neat white house on the edge of town and dismounted carefully, pulling Eleanor down into his arms again. He carried her up the steps and kicked at the door with his boot, calling out in a voice that brooked no delay, "Doc Harrison, open up, I have someone hurt here." The door flew open to reveal a gray-haired man in shirt sleeves, spectacles perched on his nose, who took one look at Eleanor's muddy, bedraggled form and stepped aside. "Bring her through to the examination room," he said briskly, already leading the way down a narrow hallway. "What happened?" "Wagon overturned in the storm," the cowboy said, following with Eleanor still in his arms. "Pinned her for at least 10 minutes before I found her. Legs and back took the weight." Doc Harrison gestured to a clean table covered with a white sheet, and the cowboy laid Eleanor down with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. The doctor immediately began his examination, prodding and pressing while asking Eleanor questions about what hurt and where. Eleanor answered as best she could, but her eyes kept drifting to the cowboy, who stood back against the wall, water still dripping from his coat onto the floor, watching with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "You are a very lucky young woman," Doc Harrison finally announced. "Severe bruising and some muscle damage, but no breaks, no internal bleeding that I can detect. You will be in considerable pain for the next few weeks, and you will need to stay off your feet as much as possible while you heal. Do you have family in Helena who can care for you?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "My father, Martin Sutton. We have a homestead about 15 miles northwest of town. I was bringing supplies back from Helena when the storm caught me." "Martin Sutton," the doctor repeated, frowning. "I know him. Good man." "Does he know you are here?" "No, he will be worried sick when I do not return tonight." Eleanor tried to sit up and gasped as pain shot through her back. The cowboy was beside her instantly, his hand on her shoulder, easing her back down. Easy, he said. Do not push it. Someone needs to tell him, Eleanor insisted, looking between the doctor and the cowboy with desperate eyes. He will think I am dead out there in the storm. The storm is still too dangerous for riding, Doc Harrison said firmly. We will send word first thing in the morning when it is safe. For tonight, you will stay here where I can monitor you. I have a spare room upstairs. He turned to the cowboy. Gabriel, thank you for bringing her in. That was quick thinking. Gabriel. Eleanor filed the name away, tasting it in her mind. Gabriel. It suited him somehow, strong and solid like the man himself. I should get back out there, Gabriel said. But he was looking at Eleanor as he spoke, his eyes searching her face. Make sure no one else got caught in this mess. You should get dry and warm, Doc Harrison countered. You have done enough heroics for one night. That wagon must have weighed half a ton. How in God's name did you lift it? Gabriel shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. Did what needed doing, he said simply. He touched the brim of his hat, water streaming from the gesture. Miss Sutton, I am glad you are all right. I will check on your wagon tomorrow. See what can be salvaged. Wait, Eleanor said as he turned to leave. I do not even know your full name. You saved my life tonight, and I should at least know who to thank properly. He paused in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and looked back at her with something that might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Gabriel Vance, he said. And you do not need to thank me, Miss Sutton. I am just glad I was riding that way tonight. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and Eleanor heard the front door open and close. She lay back on the examination table, suddenly exhausted, her whole body aching, and stared at the ceiling while Doc Harrison bustled about preparing medicine for the pain. Gabriel Vance is a good man, the doctor said conversationally as he measured out a dark liquid into a small glass. Works as a ranch hand for the Double V spread south of here. Been in Helena about 2 years now. Keeps to himself mostly, but he has a reputation for being reliable and apparently stronger than an ox from what I just saw. Eleanor accepted the glass and drank, grimacing at the bitter taste. I have never seen anything like it, she admitted. The wagon was so heavy, and he just lifted it like it weighed nothing. I thought he was mad when he said he would do it. Desperate times call for desperate measures, Doc Harrison said. And you are lucky he came along when he did. Much longer under that weight, and we might be having a very different conversation right now. He helped her sit up slowly, supporting her back. Let us get you upstairs and into some dry clothes. My wife will have something you can borrow. The next hour passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion as Mrs. Harrison, a kind woman with gentle hands, helped Eleanor out of her ruined dress and into a clean nightgown, then tucked her into a soft bed in a small upstairs room. The medicine Doc Harrison had given her was already making her drowsy, pulling her down into darkness, and Eleanor let herself sink into it gratefully. Her last conscious thought was of Gabriel Vance lifting that wagon, his face set with determination, strong enough to move the earth itself if someone needed saving. She dreamed of rain and lightning and strong arms holding her safe. Morning came with pale sunlight streaming through lace curtains and the sound of birdsong outside the window. Eleanor woke slowly, disoriented, and then gasped as she tried to move, and her body reminded her forcefully of the previous night's ordeal. Every muscle felt like it had been beaten with hammers, and her legs were so stiff she could barely bend them. Mrs. Harrison appeared in the doorway almost immediately, as if she had been listening for sounds of waking. Easy now, dear, she said, coming to help Eleanor sit up against the pillows. You are going to be very sore for a while. The doctor said to give you more medicine as soon as you woke. Eleanor accepted another dose of the bitter liquid and waited for the edge to come off the pain before attempting to speak. What time is it? She managed. Nearly 9 o'clock, Mrs. Harrison said. You slept through most of the morning, which is good. Your body needs rest to heal. And I have good news, a rider went out to your father's homestead at first light. He should arrive back here this afternoon, I expect. Relief flooded through Eleanor at those words. Her father would have been frantic with worry, and knowing he would soon be here to take her home eased something tight in her chest. "Thank you," she said, "and thank you for the clothes and the room. You have been very kind." "Nonsense," Mrs. Harrison said briskly. "What else would we do? Now, do you think you can manage some breakfast? Nothing heavy, just some broth and bread to settle your stomach." Eleanor discovered she was ravenous and managed to eat everything Mrs. Harrison brought up on a tray. While she ate, the older woman chatted about the storm, how it had blown out several windows on Main Street and knocked down a tree near the church, but thankfully no one else had been seriously hurt. "Though there was considerable excitement when Gabriel Vance came back through town this morning," she added with a knowing smile. Eleanor's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "He came back?" "Oh yes, first thing at dawn. Rode back out to find your wagon and horses from what I heard. That man does not do things by halves." Mrs. Harrison smoothed the blanket over Eleanor's legs with practiced efficiency. "He has caused quite a stir, actually. Word got around about how he lifted that wagon off you single-handed, and half the town is calling it a miracle. The other half thinks the story must be exaggerated, but I told them my husband saw Miss Sutton's injuries himself, and there is no question she was trapped under something terribly heavy." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. "It was not exaggerated," she said quietly. "I saw him do it. I do not know how, but he lifted it." "Love makes people do extraordinary things," Mrs. Harrison said, and then laughed at Eleanor's startled expression. "Oh, I do not mean that he loves you, dear. You just met. But love of humanity, compassion for a fellow soul in danger that can give a person strength beyond their normal limits. My husband has seen it before. Mothers lifting fallen beams off their children, men carrying wounded friends miles through the wilderness. The body can do remarkable things when the heart demands it." Eleanor thought about that as Mrs. Harrison took away the breakfast tray, thought about Gabriel Vance seeing her trapped beneath that wagon and deciding in an instant that he would save her no matter what it took. She barely knew the man, did not know anything about him really except his name and his profession, but she found herself wanting very much to see him again, to thank him properly, to understand what kind of person possessed that sort of courage. She got her wish late that morning when she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, and Gabriel Vance appeared in her doorway, hat in his hands, looking uncertain in a way he had not looked uncertain the night before. In the daylight, she could see him properly for the first time. Tall and lean, maybe 6 feet or a bit more, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and hazel eyes that were startling in their directness. He had changed into clean clothes, but there was fresh mud on his boots, and Eleanor guessed he had already been out to the wagon site. "Miss Sutton," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to fill the small room. "I hope I am not intruding. Mrs. Harrison said you were awake, and I wanted to check on how you were feeling." "Please come in," Eleanor said, suddenly very aware of how she must look, pale and bruised with her dark hair in a simple braid over one shoulder. "And you are not intruding at all. I was hoping I would get a chance to thank you properly for what you did." Gabriel stepped into the room, but stayed near the door, as if he was afraid of coming too close. "No thanks necessary," he said. "Anyone would have done the same." "That is not true, and you know it," Eleanor said with more force than she intended. "Most men could not have lifted that wagon if they tried with every ounce of strength they had. What you did was remarkable." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the praise. "I found your horses," he said, changing the subject. "They had run about a mile north, but they were not hurt. Just spooked. I took them back to the Double V Ranch where I work. They will be safe there until you want them." The wagon is another story. The axle broke when it tipped, and a lot of your supplies were damaged by the rain. I salvaged what I could and brought it to the general store in town for safekeeping. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, calculating the loss. The wagon could be repaired, probably, but it would cost money they did not have much of. The supplies she had purchased in Helena had been a month's worth of necessities for the homestead, and if they were ruined, she would have to find a way to replace them. Her father would understand, would tell her that her life was worth more than any amount of goods, but Eleanor hated the thought of the setback this would cause. "Thank you for taking care of that," she said, opening her eyes to find Gabriel watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I appreciate it more than I can say." "Your father should be here soon," Gabriel said. "The rider we sent found him working his north field. He dropped everything and started for town immediately. He will be relieved to see you are all right." They talked for a few more minutes, carefully polite conversation that skirted around the intensity of what had happened between them the night before, and then Gabriel made his excuses and left, saying he needed to get back to work at the ranch. Eleanor watched him go with a strange sense of loss, as if something important had just walked out of her life before she had fully grasped what it was. Her father arrived an hour later, bursting into the room with his weathered face drawn with worry, and Eleanor spent the next hour reassuring him that she was truly all right, that the injuries would heal, that she had been extraordinarily lucky. Martin Sutton was a strong man, hardened by years of working the unforgiving Montana soil, but Eleanor saw his hands shake as he held hers, saw the brightness in his eyes that spoke of tears held back through sheer will. "When you did not come home last night," he said hoarsely, "when the storm hit and you still were not back, I thought the worst. I thought I had lost you like I lost your mother." Eleanor squeezed his calloused hand, her own throat tight with emotion. Her mother had died 3 years ago, a fever that had come on sudden and virulent, taking her from them in less than a week. It had been just Eleanor and her father since then, working the homestead together, trying to build something lasting in this hard country. "I am here, Papa," she said softly. "Thanks to Gabriel Vance, I am here." Her father nodded slowly. "I heard what he did. Doc Harrison told me. I will need to find that young man and thank him myself. He works at the Double V Ranch," Eleanor said. "South of town." "I know it," her father replied. "We will stop there on the way home, if you are up to the journey. Doc says you should rest another day or two before we move you. But I know you, girl. You will want to be in your own bed as soon as possible." He was right, of course. Eleanor hated the thought of imposing on the Harrisons any longer than necessary, and she was already restless despite the pain that lanced through her body with every movement. They compromised, agreeing to wait until the following morning when Eleanor would hopefully be a bit stronger, and her father went to arrange for a wagon with good suspension to make the journey as smooth as possible. That night, lying in the small guest room while rain pattered gently against the window, another storm, though nothing like the fury of the previous night, Eleanor found her thoughts returning again and again to Gabriel Vance. She kept seeing his face as he knelt beside the overturned wagon, kept feeling his arms around her as he carried her to his horse, kept hearing his voice saying her name with such careful concern. It was ridiculous, she told herself firmly. She barely knew the man. He had done a good deed, an extraordinary deed, but that did not mean anything beyond basic human decency. But when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was Gabriel Vance who filled her dreams, his strong hands and steady eyes, his quiet competence in the face of disaster. She woke in the darkness with her heart pounding and the memory of dream warmth lingering on her skin, and she pressed her face into the pillow with something between frustration and longing. The journey back to the homestead the next day was every bit as uncomfortable as Eleanor had feared, despite her father's careful driving and the wagon's good springs. Every rut in the road sent pain shooting through her bruised body, and by the time they pulled into the yard of the Sutton homestead, Eleanor was gritting her teeth against tears. But they did stop at the Double V Ranch on the way, and Eleanor insisted on being helped down from the wagon so she could thank Gabriel properly. The ranch was a prosperous-looking spread with several sturdy buildings and good fencing, the kind of operation that spoke of money and careful management. A dozen horses grazed in a nearby paddock, and Eleanor could see cattle dotting the hills in the distance. Gabriel appeared from the barn when he heard the wagon arrive, wiping his hands on his pants, and his eyes went immediately to Eleanor standing with her father's support. Miss Sutton, he said, concern evident in his voice as he took in her pale face and the way she leaned heavily on her father. Should you be out of bed? I wanted to thank you in person before we went home, Eleanor said, offering him a smile despite the pain. And my father wanted to meet the man who saved his daughter's life. Martin Sutton stepped forward and extended his hand, which Gabriel shook with a firm grip. Gabriel Vance, I am in your debt, Martin said, his voice rough with emotion. What you did for Eleanor, I can never repay that. But I want you to know you have a friend in the Sutton family for as long as you live. Anything you need, anything at all, you come to us. Gabriel looked uncomfortable again, his cheeks darkening slightly. I appreciate that, sir, but as I told Miss Sutton, I was just doing what anyone would do. That is not true, and you know it, Martin said, echoing his daughter's words from the day before. Most men would not have even tried to lift that wagon. My Eleanor would be dead if not for you, and I will not forget that. Neither will she. Eleanor met Gabriel's eyes over her father's shoulder and saw something flash in their hazel depths, something that made her pulse quicken. Your horses are in that paddock there, Gabriel said, gesturing. They have been fed and watered, and they seem none the worse for their adventure. I can help you hitch them to your wagon if you like. That would be appreciated, Martin said. Eleanor watched from the wagon seat while the two men worked together to transfer the horses, and she found her eyes drawn again and again to Gabriel's easy competence, the way he handled the nervous animals with patience and skill. He moved with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his size, and Eleanor remembered how it had felt to be carried in those strong arms, held safe against that broad chest. When the horses were ready, Gabriel came to the wagon and looked up at Eleanor with an expression that seemed to hold a question he did not quite know how to ask. Take care of yourself, he said quietly. Follow Doc Harrison's orders and give yourself time to heal properly. Do not push too hard too soon. I will not, Eleanor promised, though they both probably knew she was lying. There was too much work on a homestead to stay idle for long. Injured or not, Gabriel hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Would it be all right if I came by in a week or so to check on how you are doing, just to make sure you are healing up the way you should? Eleanor's heart leaped at the question, but she kept her voice steady. I would like that very much. We would both like that, would we not, Papa? Absolutely, Martin agreed. You are welcome at our home any time, Mr. Vance. Gabriel, he corrected. Just Gabriel. They took their leave then, Martin clucking to the horses to start them moving, and Eleanor turned in her seat to watch Gabriel standing in the ranch yard until a bend in the road took him from view. Her father was silent for several minutes, navigating the rough track with careful attention, and then he said thoughtfully, That is a good man, Eleanor. The kind of man a father would be pleased to see courting his daughter. Eleanor felt heat flood her face. Papa, he is not courting me. He was simply being kind. Her father said noncommittally. Well, we shall see what happens when he comes to visit next week. The homestead looked exactly as Eleanor had left it 2 days before, but somehow it felt different now. Smaller, perhaps, or maybe she was the one who had changed. Her father helped her into the house, into her narrow bed, in the room that had been hers since childhood, and Eleanor lay back against the familiar pillows with a sigh of relief mixed with something that might have been disappointment. She was home. She was safe, but part of her missed the excitement of Helena, the possibility that she might turn a corner and run into Gabriel Vance. The next week passed slowly, measured out in gradually diminishing pain and the monotonous routine of homestead life. Eleanor followed Doc Harrison's orders as much as she could bear, staying off her feet for the first few days, but by the 5th day, she was up and moving around the house, ignoring her father's protests. She could not stand to be idle while he did all the work alone, and so she threw herself into the tasks she could manage, mending clothes, preparing meals, keeping the house in order. But through it all, she found her thoughts returning to Gabriel, wondering if he would truly come to visit as he had suggested, or if it had been just a polite thing to say with no real intention behind it. She caught herself watching the road that led to their homestead more times than she cared to admit, and she felt a flush of embarrassment each time she realized what she was doing. 7 days after they had returned home, Eleanor was in the kitchen, kneading bread dough, when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron and moved to the window, ignoring the lingering ache in her back. A black horse stood in the yard, and Gabriel Vance was dismounting, a cloth-wrapped package in one hand. Eleanor's hands went immediately to her hair, which was pinned up haphazardly, and she wished desperately that she was wearing something other than her oldest work dress. But there was no time to change because her father was already opening the door and calling out a welcome, and Eleanor forced herself to walk calmly to meet their guest instead of running like her foolish heart wanted to do. Gabriel looked different in the afternoon sunlight, she thought, younger somehow, less like the grim figure who had appeared out of the storm, and more like an ordinary man come calling. He had cleaned up, she noticed, wore a shirt that looked freshly pressed beneath his vest, and his hair was neatly combed back from his face. Gabrielle, her father said warmly, shaking his hand. Good to see you. Come in, come in. I hope I am not interrupting, Gabriel said. But his eyes had found Eleanor, and something in his expression made her pulse race. I said I would come check on how Miss Sutton was doing. Please call me Eleanor, she said, suddenly tired of the formality between them. After what we have been through together, I think we can dispense with Miss Sutton and Mr. Vance. Do you not agree? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Eleanor, he said, and the way he said her name sent warmth through her chest. You are looking much better than when I saw you last. I feel much better, Eleanor said. Still sore, but I am healing. Thank you for asking. Gabriel held out the cloth-wrapped package. I brought you something. It is not much, just some herbs that are good for bruising and pain. Mrs. Chen at the general store in Helena put it together when I told her about your injuries. Eleanor took the package, touched by the thoughtfulness. That is very kind of you. Please, sit down. I was just making bread, but I can take a break. Would you like some coffee? I would, thank you. They settled around the kitchen table, the three of them, and conversation flowed easily in a way that surprised Eleanor. Gabriel had a quiet sense of humor that emerged once he relaxed, and he told stories about working at the Double V Ranch that had both her and her father laughing. In turn, Martin shared tales of their homestead's early days, when Eleanor had been just a girl and everything about Montana had seemed foreign and strange compared to the settled East they had left behind. Where are you from originally? Eleanor asked Gabriel during a lull in the conversation. You do not sound like you grew up in Montana. Texas, Gabriel said. Born and raised on a cattle ranch down near San Antonio. I came north about 3 years ago, looking for work and a change of scenery. Ended up at the Double V and have been there ever since. Do you have family back in Texas? Martin asked. Something shuddered in Gabriel's expression, a wall coming up behind his eyes. No, he said quietly. My parents passed some years back, and I was an only child. It is just me now. Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy. She understood loneliness, understood what it was like to lose someone who could never be replaced. I am sorry, she said softly. That must be hard, being so far from home with no family to return to. Gabriel met her eyes and held them for a long moment. Home is where you make it, he said. And I have found Montana suits me well enough. The people here are good, and the land has its own beauty, if you know how to look for it. It does indeed, Martin agreed. Though it is a harsh beauty, unforgiving to those who do not respect it. Eleanor and I have learned that the hard way more times than I care to count. They talked for another hour, the afternoon sun slanting through the kitchen windows and painting everything in shades of gold, and Eleanor felt something loosening in her chest, some tightness she had not even realized was there. Gabriel fit into her kitchen as naturally as if he had always been there, his long legs stretched out beneath the table, his coffee cup cradled in his large hands. When he laughed at something her father said, Eleanor found herself studying the way his face transformed, becoming younger and lighter, and she had to look away before he caught her staring. Eventually, Gabriel rose to leave, saying he needed to get back to the ranch before dark, but as he was heading for the door, he paused and turned back to Eleanor. "Would you mind walking me out?" he asked. "I wanted to ask you something in private, if that is all right." Eleanor's heart kicked into a faster rhythm, but she kept her voice calm as she agreed and followed him into the yard. The sun was beginning to set, painting the Montana sky in streaks of orange and pink, and the air had that particular clarity that came on summer evenings in the high country. Gabriel's black horse nickered softly as they approached, and he ran a hand down its neck absently, seemingly gathering his thoughts. "I wanted to ask if I could come visit again," he said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. "Not just to check on your injuries, but just to visit, to spend time with you if you would not mind that." Eleanor felt like all the air had been knocked from her lungs. "Are you asking to court me, Gabriel?" He did meet her eyes then, and there was something vulnerable in his expression that caught at her heart. "I suppose I am," he said. "I know we barely know each other, and I am just a ranch hand without much to offer, but I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that night in the storm. I would like the chance to know you better, Eleanor, if you would be willing to give me that chance." Eleanor thought of all the reasons she should say no, should be practical and cautious. She did know him, not really, and her father needed her help on the homestead. And courting led to marriage, and marriage meant changes she was not sure she was ready for. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, "Yes, I would like that very much." Gabriel's face broke into a genuine smile, wide and bright, and Eleanor felt answering warmth bloom in her chest. "Really? Really?" she confirmed. "Though I should warn you, my father will probably have questions for you. He takes his duties as a protective parent very seriously." "I would expect nothing less," Gabriel said. "And I am happy to answer any questions he has. I have nothing to hide." He mounted his horse then, settling easily into the saddle, and looked down at her with an expression that made Eleanor's knees feel weak. "I will come back next Sunday, if that works for you. Maybe I could stay for dinner, and then we could take a walk together, if your injuries allow for it." "That sounds perfect," Eleanor said. She watched him ride away until he was just a dark speck on the horizon, and then she turned back to the house to find her father standing in the doorway with a knowing look on his weathered face. "So," he said as she climbed the steps, "Gabriel Vance is going to come courting." "It seems so," Eleanor admitted, unable to keep the smile from her face. Her father nodded slowly, considering. "I approve," he said finally. "He is a good man, steady and strong and honest. Your mother would have liked him." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes at the mention of her mother. "I think she would have," she agreed softly. The week until Sunday felt impossibly long, each day crawling by with maddening slowness. Eleanor threw herself into her work with renewed energy, much to her father's concern, but she could not help it. She needed to move, to do something with the restless energy that seemed to fill her entire body. She found herself daydreaming at odd moments, losing track of conversations, staring off into the distance while her bread burned, or her sewing lay forgotten in her lap. "You have it bad," her father observed one evening as Eleanor jumped at the sound of his voice, having been lost in thought while staring at the sunset. "I have not seen you like this since you were 16 and had that crush on the banker's son in Helena." Eleanor felt her cheeks heat. "I do not know what you are talking about." "Of course you do not," her father said dryly. "And I am sure it is pure coincidence that you have washed your hair 3 times this week and have been practicing with your mother's good china, as if royalty was coming to dinner." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again and laughed despite herself. "Am I being ridiculous?" "No," her father said gently. "You are being a young woman falling in love, and there is nothing ridiculous about that. I am happy for you, Eleanor. You deserve happiness after everything you have been through. Just promise me you will be careful with your heart." "I promise," Eleanor said, meaning it. But even as she spoke the words, she knew it was already too late. Her heart was already involved, already reaching out toward Gabriel Vance with a strength that both thrilled and terrified her. Sunday dawned clear and warm, a perfect Montana summer day, and Eleanor woke with her stomach full of butterflies. She took extra care with her appearance, wearing her best dress, a blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes, and pinning her dark hair up in a more elaborate style than she usually bothered with. Her father said nothing, but she caught him hiding a smile as she checked her reflection in the small mirror for the third time. Gabriel arrived precisely at noon, riding his black horse and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that he must have picked along the way. He had also dressed with care, Eleanor noted, wearing clean dark trousers and a white shirt beneath his vest, his boots polished to a shine. He presented the flowers to her with a slight awkwardness that she found endearing, and Eleanor took them with genuine pleasure. "They are beautiful," she said, bringing them to her face to inhale their sweet scent. "Thank you, Gabriel." Dinner was a lively affair, with Gabriel fitting easily into the rhythm of their small household. He complimented Eleanor's cooking with such sincerity that she blushed, and he engaged her father in conversation about ranching and farming with the easy knowledge of someone who understood the land and what it demanded from those who worked it. Eleanor found herself relaxing as the meal progressed, the initial nervousness giving way to simple enjoyment of Gabriel's company. After they had eaten and cleaned up the dishes, Gabriel suggested the walk he had mentioned, and Eleanor agreed eagerly despite the lingering soreness in her legs. They set out across the prairie behind the homestead, moving slowly to accommodate her still healing injuries, and for a while they walked in comfortable silence with just the sound of the wind through the grass and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. "Tell me about yourself," Gabriel said eventually. "I want to know everything. Where you grew up, what you dream about, what makes you laugh." So Eleanor told him, the words flowing more easily than she had expected. She talked about growing up in Philadelphia, the youngest child and only daughter in a family of boys, about how her mother had taught her to read and sew and play the piano, skills that had seemed so important in the city but had proven almost useless on a Montana homestead. She spoke of the journey west when she was 14, after her older brothers had struck out on their own and her father had decided to try his luck in the new territories. She described her mother's illness and death 3 years ago, the crushing grief of it, the way it had felt like the light had gone out of the world for a while. "But life goes on," she said quietly, staring out across the rolling prairie. "You learn to carry the grief with you and keep moving forward because there is no other choice. The land does not care if you are mourning. The work still needs to be done." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. "I understand that feeling. When my parents died, they were killed by Comanche raiders. When I was 20, I thought I would drown in the anger and pain of it. But eventually I realized that they would not have wanted me to give up on living. So I kept going, one day at a time, until eventually the days started to feel bearable again." Eleanor reached out impulsively and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Gabriel's hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a working man, and he squeezed her fingers gently. They walked on hand in hand, and Eleanor felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection that had sparked into life the night he pulled her from beneath that wagon. "Your turn," Eleanor said. "Tell me about Texas, about what it was like growing up there." Gabriel painted a picture with his words, describing the heat and the dust and the endless horizon, the cattle drives and the hard work and the close-knit community of ranch families who all helped each other survive in that unforgiving landscape. He spoke of learning to ride before he could properly walk, of summers spent branding cattle and breaking horses, of winters huddled around fires while the wind howled outside. His voice carried affection for that life, but also a note of finality, as if it belonged to someone else now, a different Gabriel from a different time. "Why did you leave?" Eleanor asked. "If you loved it so much, why come north?" Gabriel was silent for a long time, his eyes distant. "After my parents died, the ranch felt haunted," he said finally. Everywhere I looked, I saw ghosts. I tried to keep it going for a year, but eventually I realized I was just torturing myself. I sold the place to a neighbor and headed north with no particular destination in mind. Ended up in Montana because I ran out of money and needed work, and the Double V was hiring. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what I wanted to do with my life, but 3 years later, I am still here. Do you regret it? Eleanor asked softly. Gabriel stopped walking and turned to face her, both of his hands now holding hers. No, he said, his hazel eyes intense as they searched her face. Especially not now. If I had not come to Montana, I would never have been riding that road the night of the storm. I would never have met you. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. Gabriel, she whispered, not sure what she was asking for, but knowing she wanted something, needed something. He understood. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned down and kissed her. His lips were soft, despite the roughness of his face, gentle despite the strength she knew he possessed, and Eleanor felt her eyes flutter closed as she leaned into him. The kiss lasted only a moment, chaste and sweet, but when they pulled apart, Eleanor felt like the world had tilted on its axis. I should not have done that, Gabriel said, but he did not sound sorry. We have not been courting long enough for kissing. Your father will shoot me. Eleanor laughed, slightly breathless. My father is a practical man. He knows that people do not always follow proper timelines when their hearts are involved. Is your heart involved? Gabriel asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made Eleanor brave. Yes, she said simply. I think it has been since the moment you lifted that wagon off me. Gabriel smiled, that wide, genuine smile that transformed his entire face and pulled her into an embrace that was careful of her injuries, but no less heartfelt for it. Eleanor rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and she felt something settle in her soul, some piece clicking into place that she had not even known was missing. They walked back to the homestead as the sun began to set, and Gabriel stayed for another hour talking with Eleanor and her father before reluctantly taking his leave. At the door, he asked if he could come back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and Eleanor agreed with a happiness that seemed to radiate from her very core. The summer weeks rolled by in a haze of Sunday visits that stretched into full days, of conversations that ranged from the profound to the silly, of stolen kisses when her father's back was turned and lingering looks across the dinner table. Gabriel became a fixture at the Sutton homestead, and Eleanor found herself counting the days between his visits, marking time by the rhythm of their growing love. Her injuries healed slowly, the bruises fading from purple to yellow to gone, the pain in her back and legs diminishing until it was just a memory of discomfort rather than a constant presence. By the end of August, she was fully recovered, able to work alongside her father with her old energy, though she found her mind wandering more often than not to thoughts of Gabriel. Gabriel, for his part, seemed to be falling just as hard. He brought her gifts on his visits: wildflowers picked from the prairie, a beautifully carved wooden box he had made himself for her sewing supplies, a book of poetry he had ordered special from Helena because she had mentioned loving poetry. He talked about his dreams for the future, about maybe having his own ranch someday, a place where he could put down real roots and build something lasting. And increasingly, his dreams included Eleanor, spoke of we and our, instead of just I and my. In September, as the weather began to cool and the leaves on the aspens turned to gold, Gabriel asked Martin Sutton for permission to marry his daughter. Eleanor was not present for the conversation, having been sent to Helena for supplies with a wink from her father that told her he knew exactly what was about to happen. But when she returned that evening, she found Gabriel waiting in the yard with an expression of such joy on his face that she knew what her father's answer had been. He said yes, Gabriel told her, picking her up and spinning her around despite her laughing protests. Eleanor Sutton, your father has given me permission to ask for your hand in marriage. So I am asking, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a former Texas ranch hand who has nothing to offer but his strong back and his devoted heart? Eleanor cupped his face in her hands, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, who had become essential to her happiness in the space of a few short months. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Gabriel Vance, I will marry you. And you are wrong about having nothing to offer. You offer me everything I could ever want. They were married in October, a small ceremony in the little church in Helena with just a handful of guests. Her father, Doc Harrison and his wife, a few hands from the Double V Ranch, and Mrs. Chen from the general store, who had put together the healing herbs Gabriel had brought Eleanor months before. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper all these years, and Gabriel wore a new suit that he had bought special for the occasion and looked desperately uncomfortable in. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and Gabriel kissed his bride, Eleanor felt like her heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. They had a small celebration afterward at the Sutton homestead, with food and music and dancing that lasted into the evening, and then Gabriel took Eleanor away to the small cabin he had been building in secret for the past month on a piece of land he had bought from the Double V Ranch. It is not much yet, he said, as he carried her over the threshold, his bride in his arms, just as he had carried her that stormy night months before. Just 2 rooms and a loft, but I will add on as we need more space, as our family grows. Eleanor looked around the cabin, at the sturdy walls and the stone fireplace, and the bed piled with quilts that she recognized as having been made by Mrs. Harrison, and she felt tears prick at her eyes again. It is perfect, she whispered. Gabriel, it is absolutely perfect. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager, learning the contours of each other's bodies with gentle hands and whispered words of love. And afterward, lying in Gabriel's arms with the Montana night settling dark and peaceful around their little cabin, Eleanor thought about how strange life was, how a single moment could change everything. If that storm had not come, if the wagon had not tipped, if Gabriel had not been riding that particular road at that particular time, none of this would have happened. She would still be living at her father's homestead, working herself to exhaustion with no prospect of change or joy on the horizon. What are you thinking about? Gabriel murmured, his hand tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. About fate, Eleanor said. About how everything had to happen exactly the way it did for us to end up here. If even one thing had been different, we might never have met. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, then said, I do not know about fate, but I do know that I would ride through 1,000 storms if it meant finding you at the end of them. Eleanor turned in his arms to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude and joy into the contact, and Gabriel responded with equal fervor. They made love again as the moon rose over the Montana prairie, and Eleanor felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The winter that followed was hard, as Montana winters always were, but they faced it together in their little cabin, keeping each other warm through the long, cold nights. Gabriel continued working at the Double V Ranch while Eleanor worked their own land, planting a winter garden and preparing for the spring when they would put in their first real crops. They were poor in terms of money and possessions, but rich in the ways that mattered, in love and companionship and the quiet satisfaction of building a life together. By February, Eleanor knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, recognizing the signs from watching other women in Helena, but she waited until she was certain before telling Gabriel. She chose a Sunday evening when they were sitting by the fire, Gabriel repairing a bridle while Eleanor mended one of his shirts, the kind of domestic scene that had become their nightly routine. Gabriel, she said, setting down her sewing, I have something to tell you. He looked up, immediately attentive to the serious tone in her voice. What is it? Is something wrong? No, nothing is wrong. Quite the opposite, actually. Eleanor took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite knowing how he would react. I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby. This coming September. For a moment, Gabriel just stared at her, his face blank with shock, and then he dropped the bridle and crossed the small room in 2 strides to pull her into his arms. A baby, he said hoarsely, his face pressed into her hair. Eleanor, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Eleanor asked, even though she could feel him trembling with emotion. Happy? Gabriel pulled back to look at her, and there were tears streaming down his face. I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful and about 100 other things I do not have words for. You are giving me a family, Eleanor. A real family. They held each other for a long time, both of them crying and laughing, and Eleanor thought about how different this was from the scared, uncertain woman who had been trapped beneath a wagon 9 months ago. That Eleanor had been alone, facing an uncertain future, her world narrowed to the homestead and her father and the endless cycle of work. This Eleanor had a husband who loved her, a home of their own, and a child growing inside her. She had hope and joy and a future that seemed to stretch out bright and full of possibility. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. Eleanor continued working as much as she could, though Gabriel fretted constantly about her overdoing it and tried to take on as many of the heavy tasks as possible. They made preparations for the baby, with Eleanor sewing tiny clothes and blankets while Gabriel built a beautiful cradle from oak wood he had traded for with a traveling carpenter. Her father was beside himself with joy at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, and he showed up at their cabin several times a week with gifts for the baby or food for Eleanor, making sure his daughter and son-in-law wanted for nothing. In late September, on a clear autumn evening that reminded Eleanor painfully of the night Gabriel had proposed, she went into labor. Gabriel rode through the darkness to fetch Doc Harrison while Martin Sutton stayed with Eleanor, holding her hand and offering comfort the way she remembered him comforting her mother during the difficult birth of her youngest brother years before. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the following day, and there were moments when Eleanor was certain she could not bear another contraction, could not endure another wave of pain. But then Gabriel was back, having returned with Doc Harrison, and he took her hand and refused to leave her side, despite the doctor's suggestion that he might be more comfortable waiting outside. I am not leaving her, Gabriel said firmly. We go through this together. And they did, Gabriel coaching her through each contraction with the same steady calm he had shown that night in the storm, his presence alone giving her the strength to keep going. And finally, as the afternoon sun streamed through the cabin windows, Eleanor gave one last tremendous push and heard the thin wail of a newborn baby fill the room. It is a boy, Doc Harrison announced, cutting the cord and handing the squirming, angry bundle to Eleanor. A healthy, strong boy with good lungs, from the sound of him. Eleanor cradled her son against her chest, tears streaming down her face as she counted his tiny fingers and toes, marveling at his perfect little face and the dark hair that covered his head. Gabriel was beside her, one arm around her shoulders, staring at their child with an expression of such overwhelming love that Eleanor felt her heart might burst. He is beautiful, Gabriel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor, he is perfect. What should we name him? Eleanor asked, looking up at her husband. Gabriel touched one finger to their son's tiny hand and watched as the baby's fingers curled around it reflexively. What about Martin? He suggested. After your father. Martin Vance. Eleanor smiled through her tears. I think that is perfect. Papa will be so honored. And he was. When they told him later that evening, after Doc Harrison had declared both mother and baby healthy and gone home, Martin Sutton wept openly and held his grandson with shaking hands, whispering blessings and promises to always protect and love this child. The first year of little Martin's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and exhausted days, of learning to be parents together, of growing into their roles as a family. Gabriel proved to be a devoted father, always willing to walk the floor with a crying baby in the middle of the night, to change diapers and sing lullabies in his rough voice that somehow always soothed Martin when nothing else would. They were happy, deliriously so, though happiness did not mean the absence of hardship. Money was tight, tighter than Eleanor liked, and there were weeks when they had to choose between buying supplies they needed and paying back debts. The ranch work was brutal and unending, especially as Gabriel tried to build up their own herd while still working for the Double V, and there were nights when he came home so exhausted he could barely eat before falling into bed. But through it all, they had each other, and they had their growing family. 2 years after Martin was born, Eleanor had another baby, a daughter they named Rose, who came into the world with her mother's dark hair and her father's hazel eyes. And 2 years after that, another son, James, who was the spitting image of his grandfather Martin Sutton and just as stubborn. The years rolled by, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children, by the slow accumulation of prosperity as Gabriel's hard work began to pay off and their ranch grew from a struggling operation to a modest but successful spread. They added rooms to the cabin, expanding it into a proper house, and Gabriel bought more land when it became available, building something lasting for his family, just as he had always dreamed. Eleanor's father aged gracefully, spending more and more time with his grandchildren as the years passed, teaching them about the land and how to respect it, passing on his knowledge and experience to the next generation. He lived to see Martin turn 18, lived to see his grandson become a fine young man who had inherited both his grandfather's practicality and his father's strength, and he passed away peacefully in his sleep one winter night, content in the knowledge that his daughter was happy and his legacy would continue. They buried Martin Sutton on a hill overlooking the prairie he had loved, with all his grandchildren present to say goodbye, and Eleanor stood between her husband and her eldest son and wept for the man who had been her rock through so many difficult years. But even in her grief, she knew he had died satisfied, having lived to see his family prosper and his daughter find the kind of love that made life worth living. The years continued their steady march forward, bringing changes both joyful and sorrowful. Martin grew into a man and eventually married a sweet girl from Helena, bringing a daughter-in-law into the family that Eleanor adored. Rose proved to have her mother's practical nature and her father's determination, and she took over much of the management of the ranch as she grew older, revealing a head for business that impressed everyone who knew her. James was the wild one, always looking for adventure, and at 19, he left Montana to try his luck in the California goldfields, though he wrote long letters home describing his adventures and promising to return someday. Through it all, through the years, and the changes, and the inevitable sorrows that came with time, Gabriel and Eleanor remained devoted to each other. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate infatuation of their early courtship. On their 30th wedding anniversary, in the autumn of 1913, they took a ride together out to the place where the wagon had overturned all those years ago. The exact spot was hard to find after so long, the land having reclaimed any evidence of that night, but they found a place that felt right and dismounted to stand together in the prairie grass. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not been riding this way that night? Gabriel asked, his arm around Eleanor's waist. If I had stayed at the ranch or taken a different route home? Eleanor leaned into him, this man who had saved her life and then filled it with so much joy. I try not to, she admitted. It is too terrible to contemplate. But I am grateful every single day that you did ride this way, that you were there when I needed you most. Gabriel turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with the same gentleness he had shown that first night when she lay injured and terrified in the mud. I am the lucky one, he said quietly. You gave me everything, Eleanor. A home, a family, a reason to keep going when I thought I had nothing left to live for. You saved me just as much as I saved you. Eleanor kissed him then, there in the prairie grass with the Montana wind blowing around them and the autumn sun warm on their faces, and she tasted salt and knew that one or both of them was crying. But they were happy tears, tears of gratitude for a life well lived and a love that had endured through 3 decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set. The same sky that had been dark with storm clouds, the night they met now painted in shades of gold and pink and orange. The house rose before them, expanded and improved over the years, but still recognizably the cabin that Gabriel had built for his bride so long ago. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Eleanor knew that Rose would have dinner waiting, probably with Martin and his wife and their children present as well, the family gathering to celebrate the anniversary. As they dismounted and Gabriel helped Eleanor down from her horse, she paused to look at their land, at the house and the barn and the fences that stretched toward the horizon, at the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. This was what they had built together, what they had created from nothing but love and determination and bone-deep stubbornness. This was their legacy. "What are you thinking about?" Gabriel asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night so many years before. Eleanor smiled and took his hand, lacing their fingers together the way she had on that first walk across the prairie when she had known, bone deep, that this man was going to be her future. "I am thinking about how blessed I am," she said. "How blessed we are to have found each other, to have built this life together, to have our children and grandchildren carrying on what we started. I am thinking that if I could go back to that night in the storm and change anything, I would not, because that night brought you into my life, and you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Gabriel pulled her close, his arms strong and steady around her despite the years they had seen, and Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder and listened to the beat of his heart. It was the same heart that had refused to give up when she was trapped and terrified, the same heart that had loved her through 3 decades of marriage, the same heart that would love her until the very end. "Come on," Gabriel said softly. "Our family is waiting for us." They walked toward the house together, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long in the evening light. Through the windows, Eleanor could see movement, could hear the sound of children's laughter and adult conversation, the warm buzz of family gathered together. And as Gabriel opened the door and the light and warmth spilled out to embrace them, Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace settle over her soul. This was home. This was family. This was love. And it had all begun with a storm, a fallen wagon, and a cowboy strong enough to lift the weight of the world when someone needed saving. Eleanor sent up a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided Gabriel to that road on that particular night, to the twist of fate or providence or simple chance that had brought them together. She did not know if she believed in destiny, but she believed in love, and she believed in the man standing beside her whose hands still fit perfectly in hers after 3 decades together. As they stepped into the house and were immediately surrounded by their children and grandchildren offering congratulations and affection, Eleanor caught Gabriel's eye across the room and saw her own contentment reflected back at her. They had built something beautiful together, something lasting, and no matter what the future held, they would face it the same way they had faced everything, together, with love and courage and an unshakable faith in each other. The evening passed in celebration and laughter, in the retelling of family stories and the making of new memories. And when it was finally over, and everyone had gone home, and Gabriel and Eleanor were alone in their bedroom, they held each other close and counted their blessings. 3 children, 8 grandchildren so far with more on the way, a prosperous ranch, and a love that had not only survived, but thrived through 3 decades of marriage. "I love you," Gabriel whispered in the darkness. "More today than yesterday, and less than tomorrow." "I love you too," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for lifting that wagon, Gabriel. Thank you for saving me." "Thank you for letting me," Gabriel said, and Eleanor heard the smile in his voice. "Thank you for saying yes when I asked to court you, and yes when I asked you to marry me. Thank you for this life we have built together." They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, and Eleanor's last waking thought was of gratitude, pure and simple, for the extraordinary gift of ordinary love that had transformed her existence from mere survival into something rich and full and deeply, profoundly meaningful. The years that followed their 30th anniversary were gentler than the ones that had come before. Gabriel retired from the hardest ranch work, leaving most of the physical labor to Martin and Rose, while he focused on the management and planning side of things. Eleanor spent her time tending her garden and helping with the grandchildren, passing on her knowledge of cooking and sewing and all the practical skills that made a house into a home. They traveled occasionally, taking the train to visit James in California, where he had finally settled after years of wandering, enjoying the novelty of seeing the ocean and the different landscape of the West Coast. But they always came home to Montana, to their ranch and their family, because that was where their hearts lived. In the spring of 1918, as the world was consumed by war and the news from Europe grew increasingly dire, Eleanor and Gabriel celebrated their 35th anniversary. It was a quieter affair this time, just their immediate family gathered for Sunday dinner, but no less meaningful for its intimacy. Martin proposed a toast to his parents, his voice gruff with emotion, as he spoke of their example of love and commitment, of how they had shown him and his siblings what a marriage should be. To Ma and Pa, he said, raising his glass, who proved that true love exists and that it can endure anything if you are willing to fight for it. May we all be so blessed as to find what you found in each other. Hear, hear, everyone echoed, raising their glasses, and Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she looked around the table at the family she and Gabriel had created. This was their triumph, their legacy, these people who carried their blood and their values forward into the future. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Gabriel moved slowly, his joints stiff from decades of hard work, and Eleanor saw him wince as he bent to remove his boots. She went to him immediately, kneeling before him despite her own protesting knees, and took over the task with gentle hands. "We are getting old," Gabriel observed with a wry smile. "We are getting well loved," Eleanor corrected. "Every ache and pain is a reminder of the life we have lived, the work we have done, the family we have raised. I would not trade a single gray hair or wrinkle for youth without you." Gabriel cupped her face in his weathered hands, his touch as tender as it had been when she was a bride of 23. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked softly. "We both got lucky," Eleanor replied. "The night of the storm, when you came riding out of the darkness that was luck for both of us. You needed someone to save just as much as I needed saving. We rescued each other, Gabriel, and we have been doing it every day since." They climbed into bed, and Gabriel pulled Eleanor close, her back against his chest, his arm draped over her waist in the position they had slept in for 3.5 decades. And as Eleanor drifted off to sleep, she thought about how many nights they had lain just like this, how many mornings they had woken up together, how many days they had worked side by side building their life. It was a good life, she thought. A very good life indeed. Gabriel Vance passed away peacefully in his sleep on a cold January morning in 1923, 2 months after his 70th birthday. Eleanor woke to find him still beside her, his face peaceful, one hand still resting on her arm as if even in death he was reaching for her. The grief was crushing, a physical weight that pressed down on her chest and made it hard to breathe. But even through the pain, she was grateful. Grateful that he had not suffered. Grateful that they had been given so many years together. Grateful that his last moments had been spent beside her in their bed. They buried him on the hill next to her father, with all their children and grandchildren present, and half of Helena besides, because Gabriel had been well loved in the community. Martin read from the Bible with a shaking voice. Rose wept openly in her husband's arms, and James had come all the way from California to say goodbye to the man who had been not just his father, but his hero. Eleanor stood at the graveside and thought about the first time she had seen Gabriel, materializing out of the storm like an avenging angel, strong and capable, and utterly determined to save her. She thought about their wedding day, about the births of their children, about 35 years of ordinary moments that had woven together into an extraordinary life. And she whispered goodbye to the love of her life, the man who had lifted a wagon off her when she was trapped, and who had spent every day since making sure she never felt trapped again. Thank you, she said softly, placing a hand on the cold earth that now covered his grave. Thank you for everything. Eleanor lived another 7 years after Gabriel's death, years spent watching her grandchildren grow and her great grandchildren be born, years devoted to preserving the ranch that she and Gabriel had built and ensuring their legacy would continue. She wrote down their story in a leather bound journal that Rose had given her, wanting future generations to know how it had all begun, how a storm and a fallen wagon and a cowboy's extraordinary strength had changed the course of two lives. When Eleanor Vance passed away peacefully in her sleep on a warm summer night in 1930, her children buried her beside Gabriel on the hill overlooking the prairie. And if anyone had been there to see, they might have noticed that the two graves seemed somehow closer than they should be, as if even the earth itself recognized that these two souls belonged together. The ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, and the story of Gabriel lifting the wagon off Eleanor became family legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for those who had been there, who had known Gabriel and Eleanor, who had witnessed their love firsthand, no embellishment was necessary. The truth was remarkable enough. A cowboy had seen a woman in danger, had refused to accept that saving her was impossible, and had somehow found the strength to do what should not have been possible. And from that moment of extraordinary courage had grown a love that had sustained two people through decades of joy and hardship, that had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after both of them were gone. It was a simple story, really, a love story, the best kind there was.